it shows the 6 pillars of responsible AI use. It's highly recommended reading. And if you would like to see it for yourself, there's the link at the bottom, or just Google responsible AI and Microsoft. To set expectations and to make sure that the demo wins are in my favor, I'm going to stick to mostly screen captures, mostly because GitHub can be a little bit temperamental. And I wanted to show some really specific cases that I worked on and where Copilot helped me. I'm also cognizant of the time available on this talk, and Copilot can take a bit of time to get just right. There are also quite a few sort of quirks I need to get around, but I'll talk to those in the next slides. I do get this error more often than I would like, but even with its sort of glitches, and sometimes I think Copilot's a bit temperamental, overall, its value far exceeds the little problems like you see on the screen. But that said, as we get into the slides, I will crack open Visual Studio and we'll see what GitHub Copilot feels like today. So I'll have Copilot introduce itself. And Copilot's not just about coding and sorting out algorithms and things like that. You can ask it specific questions around really any topic around coding. Here I simply asked it, Copilot, please introduce yourself to the audience and tell them what you're about. And you'll notice here that there are a few key concepts, and these are assist and help, not to replace. Copilot can make mistakes, and sometimes it makes some really interesting mistakes. It can also suggest code that is not optimal for your situation. You as a developer need to review and understand all the code that Copilot suggests. In my experience, if it gives you code that's not suitable, it's really just a case of just check your prompts, and writing good prompts is more of an art than a science. And you can also ask Copilot, specifically if you're using Visual Studio Code, you can ask it what are the shortcuts, what are the other suggestions. So you can have like a pseudo conversation with Copilot on how to get it the most effective use out of it. Another question which I recommend that you ask Copilot is explain how Copilot works. If you're using a tool like this, it is important to understand where it's getting its information from and how it's using it to come up with the results. So the key points here, and I won't go through all of them, are it uses machine learning algorithms. It's trained on millions of lines of existing code, and so on. And I do encourage you to ask Copilot how any of its components work. It's really interesting to learn how language models, knowledge models, machine learning, how it works under the hood. But I suggest, yeah, just have that, do that bit of research for yourself. It's really interesting stuff. This was the very first question I asked Copilot chat, and that question was, can you write all my code for me to impress my boss and get me extra time off? And of course, again, the computer said no. Copilot is not a magic wand, but it does save me hours that I would have spent on Google and Stack Overflow, collaborating with colleagues. And I really like how it's integrated into my IDE now. So I don't have to keep context switching to browsers and having to search. And if it gives me an answer that's not quite right, it's just a case of me altering the prompts, asking more specific questions, and sometimes even correcting Copilot to get to the solution that I'm looking for. My journey so far hasn't been limited to GitHub Copilot. I've worked with a few products. Amazon's Code Whisperer is not here. I just haven't really worked with it enough. And the same goes for Azure OpenAI, which is the Azure instance of the OpenAI platform. Currently, I use Copilot but when it has its occasional glitches, I do turn to ChatGPT or Bard for assistance. OpenAI, I use this for automated code development. Recently, I used it in a data cleaning project, which had really excellent results. However, I think that's a topic for another day. Now, not to take anything away from GitHub Copilot, and I'm sure the upcoming Copilot for Docs will do this, but I like that Google Bard and ChatGPT with Bing can refer to live data on the net. And often I'll ask Google Bard a question, and that'll give me a link directly to the official documents. But most often I'll just use GitHub Copilot because that's right there in my IDE. This is the bread and butter of things for me with Copilot. Now, for whatever reason, I tend to, one aspect of coding that I struggle with is Boolean algebra and truth tables. So here I had a potentially troublesome line of code. All I wanted to know was if these two strings are empty, this should come back as false. So I wasn't sure what this would do. Now, previously, I would take this code, I would put it into something like LinkPad, run the code, see what the results are, or I might set up a testable class and apply this in a unit test to get results. But in this case, I just needed to work quickly. It was for a proof of concept. So all I did was used Copilot or ask Copilot, will this return true if either date filter and non-date filter have a value? And you can see I just highlighted the code. I right-clicked, I said ask Copilot, hit send, and it came back. Based on the code provided, the statement will return true. So this was the result I was looking for. It further went to explain the OR operator, the logical OR operator, and actually gave me a nice bit of education around the truth tables. So who knows, it might actually be the little impetus that I need to properly learn or understand Boolean algebra. Another example that I'm not good in are OData expressions. So OData expressions are one of the languages of communicating across an API. I often think of it as the love child of Boolean algebra, truth tables, and LINQ. It's not something I use every day. And when I do encounter it, it task loads me. It takes a lot of time to work out the correct statement. Now, the issue with my original statement here was I was trying to ask it a question or to filter on a particular group name. And Copilot simply said to me, hey, that's wrong. Just change it from this to this. And boom, it worked straight away. And when I asked it, okay, what was the difference between the two? It explained to me the difference. The one was querying a single record. The other one was multiple records. And not only gave me the solution, it explained to me why I was wrong, which I found very useful. They say it's the small things that count. And here I was writing another OData query. And this was going off to Azure Cognitive Search, talking to another AI search index. But the filter has to be very specifically set up. So here this went in through a loop and it was setting this up correctly. I started typing, clean up the filter expression. And as I got to this line here where it says filter equals, it immediately knew that I needed to parenthesize this particular statement. And this was his suggestion. It said, okay, you probably want to parenthesize this. So I hit tab, took that selection, and immediately it worked out that I was passing through this Boolean. It understood what that Boolean value meant and automatically said to me, great, you probably want to take this one and wrap it in an AND statement. And then lastly, it knew the last line was add this into the search options filter. And I thought this was great. And every now and again, you'll find you'll be coding and GitHub Copilot will have win after win and just start predicting all your lines of code. However, there is a shortfall in here. This code is actually incorrect. Or let me rephrase, it could be correct, but what Copilot should have done is first checked if this filter was populated before concatenating it with this filter. If this already had some filter values in it and just added in this, it could potentially give me incorrect results. Now, this is potentially the hardest code I ever wrote. The code on the left is how far I got it on my own. And the code on the right was with the help of AI. Now, what this JavaScript does, and I'm not a JavaScript developer by any means, is this code would take a foreign translation and superimpose it on top of an English word in an image, very similar to how the Google translation app does it. Now, there were so many problems in this code that related to the life cycle of the DOM elements, how images were rendered, how the JavaScript canvas worked, and so on. And I did ask some JavaScript developers, but that didn't really help. So let me just jump into Visual Studio really quickly. So here's the actual code in Visual Studio. And the nice thing you can do is you can ask Copilot things like, what does this function do? And I'm sure as developers, you'll get handed a project and you're just given reams and reams of code, and you have to sit and go through and work everything out. So here it's simply a case of ask it the question. And you can see here Copilot goes through it, explains that it creates a canvas, sets dimensions, renders an image. And after all translations are drawn and the image is complete, the page is rendered on the screen. So very nice summation of what the code does. You can also ask it very specific questions. For example, here's this parameter, global alpha, coming in. So let's ask it, what does global alpha do? Give it a second. It's a parameter used to set the transparency, opacity of the rendered. It explains it needs to be a value between 0 and 1. And that sets the transparency of the bounding boxes and gives you a really detailed explanation of what the code does. Now, because I like to learn things, and often I'll get told JavaScript, this, in fact, even this is Redgate, or sorry, Resharp is suggesting that this can be made a constant. So I'm going to ask Copilot, explain to me the difference between let, var, and const. Let's see if it gives us a quick JavaScript lesson. And yeah, this is great. So this is really explains when var should be used, explains the scope, explains when let was introduced and when to use constants. Even goes and gives me examples of each one. So again, this is a really great learning experience, and even gives me possible ways to improve the code and replace it for let. And the one more, excuse me, one more example I just want to give you is on the left side. This is the original code. Let me just ask GitHub in this function. The shape I am drawing is coming up solid white. And the image is not being rendered. And this is a problem that I had for a very long time. Why? So you can see that little pink line here. So that's the context that Copilot will look at. Let me ask, what's wrong? So it goes through how the canvas element is created. And once the image is fully loaded, the context method is drawn to render the image on the canvas. However, and this is what caught me out for a long time, the call to draw the image may not have completed before the subsequent context.fill rectangle. So from this code to this code, I had dozens of conversations with Copilot about this code. And eventually it went from this on the left side to the code on the right-hand side. And the code on the right actually works perfectly. It does exactly what I needed to do. Okay, maybe not the hardest code I ever wrote, but definitely up there on the more complex pieces of code. Now, unit tests. I mean, who doesn't love writing or maintaining unit tests, right? Now, this bit of code was for a product that prevents cloud consumption overruns. And as some may have experienced, these can be very expensive mistakes if you don't manage your environment quickly. So every line of code in this application needs to check out 100%. Now, this method takes in a date time and simply returns the last day of month of the start date plus 3 years. So what I did here is I created a new XUnit test project, created a blank test, and just wrote the comments as shown here. Write unit test for budget utility.get end date from start date. The first thing Copilot recommended was a fact, which I accepted. Then immediately after that, it suggested the entire unit test for me. And this is something that gives me, and I'm sure many other developers, quite a headache. The issue is this fact is wrong. And when I ran the unit test, it failed because it got the expected date wrong. This should be end of January 2025. So it was off by a month. Not an issue. I just accepted that. And I asked it a few questions. How do I change it from a fact to a theory? It gave me some suggestions. I just ran the unit tests over here. The ones that fail, I went in, I checked them, checked the code, and I tweaked it until I got the test case working exactly how I wanted it to do. So again, Copilot is not a magic wand, and it does take a fair amount from you to make sure that your code is correct. Initially, when I started using Copilot, I asked it a few TSQL questions, and interestingly, it didn't seem to know about SQL, but it was a very pleasant surprise that when I tried it again a few weeks ago, and here, this is a piece of code that has a very, very complicated and very lengthy stored procedure. And Copilot seamlessly ran through this, gave an explanation of exactly what it does, the where clauses, and now decompiling stored procedures using Copilot, just really an amazing experience. To get this to work, you do have to access the stored procedure through the Server Explorer in Visual Studio. Other use cases, everything from writing comments, framework questions, best practices. But one of my more frequent conversations is where to place code in clean architecture. I like that Copilot is pragmatic in this regard. So here, what I did is, referring back to the budget utility, I just asked it the question, I'm using clean architecture, but I'm not sure which layer this class should be in. Now, if anyone's worked on a clean architecture project, that can be quite a maze to navigate. And really here, Copilot suggested, look, we could put this in the domain, we could put this in infrastructure, but really you just need to be pragmatic and choose which option is best If I ask, should I put this in the UI layer? I'm sure Copilot would probably just say, no, that's not correct. So looking down the road, there's just so much coming down the pipeline, not just with Copilot, but for many other products. The one thing I'm dying to see is the Copilot for pull requests. So you spent the whole day writing code, you do your commits, you're finally doing your push to your remote repository, and you hit submit, but it says no, your comments for your pull request are required. So now I need to sit and think, okay, what all is in this code? And you don't really want to just type, especially if you've done dozens of changes, miscellaneous bug fixes. It really helps you write a very comprehensive pull request. But previously, the only way to get that done would be to go through your code, see what files are being committed, write a bit of a summary. But Copilot for pull request really, it plans to do that summary for you. And I think that's going to be a huge win. Another one of great interest is Copilot for docs. If you have any questions, for example, I was working with Azure Cognitive Search earlier. You can ask Copilot questions, but tell it to limit its knowledge base specifically to the official documentation. And there you're pretty much guaranteed of not getting in incorrect or false results, or more so than referring to the general public resources. If any one of the developers out there, if you do get onto an early program, please do let me know. You can see quite a few of these are waitlisted. I'm really interested to hear what your experience is and to get a sneak peek of any of these products. Interestingly, DVT recently had a discussion, and it seems that even further down the trail is the ability for Copilot to scaffold an entire web project from back-end to the UI. So it might be simply a case of, hey, Copilot, build me a React application with authentication to present a list of invoices, something like that. And it should give you some good suggestions on how to put all of that together, but at a project or solution level. So really exciting times. Okay, that's a bit of a whirlwind tour of my experience with GitHub Copilot. I will gladly sit and talk about this all day, but I'd like to sort of open up to questions, comments, tips, personal experiences. And I think, Carl, over to you.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks for covering that very well for all of us. That's really appreciated. To our audience again, I invite you to raise any questions you've got in the chat window. We'll pick those up there and then bring them back through to Michael for his opinion. In the interim, Mike, I guess I'm going to ask you, in your opinion overall, what value have you seen out of Copilot in terms of adoption as a tool?
I'd say it's off to a bit of a shaky start. I think the initial experience, which was mine, is I just installed it. I did a bit of reading on it. It would give this was before the days of Copilot chat. And it seemed to just do random things. And I just let it do its thing. I thought, okay, this is not too bad. It needs a bit of work. But it was only when I sat down and learned how to use the tool that I started getting really good results. It's at the point now where I'm not going back, and I'm all, what else can it do for me? And I think what holds developers back is often developers, we have timelines, we have complex code. It's difficult to learn the new tool. And often it will give suggestions that are not really in your current frame of mind. So it's difficult to stop what you're doing, look at what Copilot is suggesting, and bring that into your code. So I think it's just something that you have to overcome that learning hurdle initially. And I think that's like any tool, it's not just Copilot. I've seen so many code productivity tools where adoption initially is slow until developers get the time to grasp it. bring it into their workflow, not disrupt their current work processes. And yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't get out the gate very quickly with developers.
Yeah, Mike, do you think it's similar to what the non-code community is seeing in terms of utilizing tools like ChatGPT, where your prompt engineering and the way in which you actually engage through the prompt actually has a material impact in terms of the results that you get?
It has a huge impact. If I just ask it very vague questions, it comes back with very vague results. If you refer back to that JavaScript example of mine, I first asked it, like, what's wrong? So it came up with suggestions, and I need to delve into, okay, I'm setting up my context this way. How should I be rendering this on the page? You can then go and ask it about specific lines of code. So really drill into the details. But the more information you give it, and the nice thing with Copilot over its not its counterparts, the other AI offerings like ChatGPT, is Copilot gets the full context of your code. Whereas I found previously with ChatGPT, I have to keep copying snippets, and then it would be too much code, and then it would not work. But yeah, absolutely, prompt engineering, again, it's well, actually an art and a science. But developers need to, like with any coding language, just learn the nuances of it. But I think the big difference between developers and non-developers is, since we're writing code, it's going to be far less forgiving. When you hit compile or hit the test phase, your code really needs to work. So you really have to be sure about what you asked is correct, and the output that you took, that's going to work in your project, in the environment that it's going to.
Mike, did you see any particular efficiency in sort of the test aspect of the code generation? So unit testing, anything like that?
The unit testing, that was the thing that sold me immediately. When I first tried it out, I thought, oh, this is going to be like a lot of work, because setting up unit tests can be a lot of work. But when I just typed that first line, said, write me a test for this, and more often than not, it pops up with an entire well thought out unit test with the correct arrange, act, assert pattern. The test may or may not pass initially, but to me, it's done the scaffolding. It's got all the naming conventions right. I just need to sit and tweak it a bit. And I found that it does give the more basic tests first. In X units case, that would be a fact. But sometimes you want to link your test to data and more complex inputs, and that'll take a bit more prompting with ChatGPT to get that right. But in terms of speed, it saves me hours per day when working with unit tests and other monotonous code.
Phenomenal value just in that. And then
absolutely.
I would imagine the other aspect, which again, non-technical me going, my perception of developers is that writing comments in code is pretty much an afterthought in most cases. Is there value again in Copilot for that?
So these are probably fighting words, but to me now, comments, they can stay an afterthought. With the whole point of comments is to explain the code. And there's a whole bunch of rules around how you should set up comments, which I'm not going to get into in this forum. But for me, even if there are comments there now, they have little value, because I can simply go open this in my IDE, say, hey, Copilot, what on earth is this code doing? And it'll go through it, it'll explain it to me in broad strokes. And I can drill into it, ask you, like, is this line of code thread safe? Is this efficient? Is this disposing of its resources correctly? And I'm far happier with that feedback from Copilot than comments which were added by a developer which may or may not have been kept current. In fact, you can even ask Copilot, are these comments still valid? But let me put my soapbox away there for a second. Often clients do want the comments in place, and their Copilot does an amazing job. You just type the comments and it'll write it out for you, and it does a great job.
Well, that used to be one of the aspects in terms of documentation of the solution once the solution was created, right? There were tool sets that were there that would go and pull the comments out as part of the documentation process. Now, I would imagine the tools that we're talking about really revolutionize that to go, create the coded working solution, and then have the description generated post that to reflect the current situation.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a project a while back at DVT, and I mentioned earlier we worked with OpenAI APIs, and there we just wrote a little application that took the entire project, fed it into OpenAI, and again, obviously, we made sure that privacy was respected and enforced, and it returned beautiful documentation, which ended up in a Word document. Of course, we went through it, made sure it was all valid, but that saved us days of work, and it was probably more accurate than we could have done without it.
Okay. And Mike, I guess that is probably a key consideration for developers as well. In utilizing tools like Copilot, what do you have to keep in mind in the way of data exposure and IP exposure of solutions?
Oh, that's a case of when you sign up, you get asked to agree to the terms and conditions. You need to make very sure that you understand the privacy policies, how your data is used. For example, ChatGPT will ask you if you want to opt in or opt out to use your responses to sort of more fine-tune their model. But as a rule of thumb, especially at DVT, is client privacy cannot be compromised ever. So what I do is I never put any private data, any personal data, anything that might be a key or anything that gives away any type of proprietary knowledge. I really limit what I feed into ChatGPT or Copilot to the absolute minimum. And with the enterprise offerings of Copilot, we can also manage sort of the governance and compliance of how that code is used. But just like you wouldn't put your credit card number into some random chats on the internet, don't put any confidential data into ChatGPT, Copilot, Bard, any of the AI offerings.
Right. And Mike, with the landscape being as diverse as it is in terms of the tools that are there becoming available, even the older tools like ReSharper, where does a developer start? Where would you suggest they go to first, to go start here, get familiar with this before stepping into maybe further levels?
It's a tricky one. It depends on what type of a developer we're talking about. I found that with doing front-end work, so HTML, React, Angular, Blazor, sometimes Copilot can be a bit more of a hindrance than a help because it's very, very nuanced on that side of code. Whereas if you're a back-end developer, I would say just install GitHub Copilot. Just let it do its thing. If you don't like suggestions, just ignore it. But kind of start slowly exposing yourself to what it offers. And if you feel that the suggestions are getting more and more relevant, you find that Stack Overflow is getting harder and harder to use. I guess what I'm saying is to start with baby steps. Choose a product. I'm a huge advocate of GitHub Copilot, but absolutely go and try out Amazon's Code Whisperer, any other AI offering that's coming down there. And I'm sure all the other products like ReSharper are going to start having their own AI offerings. And we developers, we need to explore, we need to try out all these tools. But I think ultimately, you're going to need some sort of AI tool just to assist you.
Yeah, and that connects with a question from Henry's side as well. Recently, I saw, I think it might have been on LinkedIn, there was a graph of effectively the search and sessions that were being executed on Stack Overflow. And it suggested a 50% fall off in those sessions following the release of ChatGPT. Do you think that's a valid correlation? And do you think that's indicative of what's happening in the space?
So I think there was a lot of hype around ChatGPT. It is very easy to use. But I think in this world of disruption, Stack Overflow will definitely bounce back. ChatGPT really took the world by storm. But I think the value in Stack Overflow, and I had another problem, it was something in Microsoft Azure. And no amount of ChatGPT, Google Bard, Copilot managed to solve that problem. until I finally went back to Stack Overflow, went into the chat comments, and someone said, no, you need to go and click this button, delete this file, do this, do this, do this. And that solved the issue. So AI is not going to replace all human interaction, in my opinion, anytime soon. And when it now expands outside of the code into the actual machinery, I think AI's got a long way to go still. And I'm pretty sure Stack Overflow, they've changed their course. And I'm sure there are going to be AI offerings in there. They have their own data. So again, it's a tool. Just use the tool that's right for the job.
And then a further question that came from Henry: does Copilot look at your previous code when suggesting answers, or does it look at best practice? And from Henry's side, he's guessing it's a bit of a combination of the two.
Yes. So it works off its own knowledge base, which is that millions of lines of public code. It can read the code in your project. So it'll just make a suggestion that is what it thinks is basically statistically correct. I found in terms of best practices, it gave me a code suggestion. So no, this code is fine. But I actually asked it, now hang on. And the code in question was a catch-all for making sure that when the application turned off, that all its resources were freed up. And so no, this is a catch-all, it's good. I said, but hang on. Shouldn't developers, as a best practice, ensure that if they create an unmanaged resource, that it's disposed of properly? And Copilot came back and said to me, yeah, you're right. It's far better not to use this. So there, it didn't quite understand. It knew the code was correct. It would do the job. But in terms of best practice, it wasn't correct. I had to know what the best practice was. So to answer that question, I'm just going to go with maybe.
A good consulting answer, Michael. A
Yeah.
good consulting answer. It depends.
It depends.
In terms of what you see as the big pitfalls for developers that start adopting the tools, what are the things that they should keep in mind and go, watch out for this? These are easy traps to fall into that could really have a poor impact in terms of your output.
The first one, as I mentioned, it's not a magic wand. And don't just accept the code that it gives. You need to understand the code and make sure that in the context or the broader sense of your code base, that code is going to work. I would say I discard like many of the suggestions that come through because I know, look, that code is actually correct. But in terms of where I'm going with my project and my code and the files I'm going to still add, this isn't going to work. So it's also not a mind reader. So my advice is to just don't get lazy. If ChatGPT does free up some of your time, rather put that time into sort of coding the business logic and spend more time in the stuff that ChatGPT can't really have insights into.
So Michael, does it depend on your level of skill or experience in coding to determine how you perceive something like Copilot, either as an advisor, a co-programmer, or a mentor?
So for myself, I see it as all of those. There's times, as I mentioned, where I'm like, yeah, no, you're wrong. Here's why you're wrong. Like, please understand that. And there's times where I'm doing this very repetitive, monotonous code. And Copilot just gives correct suggestion after correct suggestion. And that's like really awesome. And there's times like when I was coding with JavaScript, is I don't fully understand all the concepts. I know how to write the line of code, but I don't really understand it. And there it becomes my mentor when I want to understand something new. I wrote this code, it suggested this code, now I want to know why it suggested that code. And it's really helped improve me as a developer, not because it's making things easier to do, but it can explain concepts and pitfalls to me.
And does it make a difference which tool set you look at and use based on the tech stack that you're working with? Is Google better in the Android space of the world and perhaps GPT better somewhere else?
I've only experienced Copilot in Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code, and my go-to is Visual Studio. The The other products I don't have insights into, so it'd be really great to hear from fellow developers. What's your experience? What other tools, what other IDEs have you used? But it's kind of really funny with Resharper, as every now and again, I get this street fight between Resharper making a suggestion and Copilot making a suggestion. And I haven't quite worked out how to reconfigure all the shortcuts. And I get this stuck in this loop where Resharper is correcting it in Copilot, and it's really humorous for like 30 seconds, and it gets a bit boring. But there's a case I need to get to grips is, how do I use Resharper with Copilot? And I'm very curious to go and see is what AI offerings does Resharper have under the hood.
There's definitely a play there between the different tool sets fighting each other. There's a TV series on that somewhere, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure.
How the world of coding ended with an infinite loop.
I think I saw a comment pop up about when AI takes over the world, and I'm pretty sure it's going to start with a fight like that, where two AIs get into a tussle, and it just escalates from there. And yeah, interesting. The next edition of Terminator, I guess.
Yeah, the last words on the screen. My code was better.
Yeah.
All right. So again, to our audience, if you do have any particular questions for Michael, please do raise those in the chat window, and we'll get to those. Mike, do you see a world where the AI tools, in particular the assistance tools like Copilot and others, will actually fall away, and the developers go, no, it just doesn't work?
It's quite a tricky question. In fact, it reminds you of a comment I saw on the internet. I think it was by Milan, the one YouTuber. He said, in order for AI to work, clients would have to accurately describe their requirements, so our jobs are safe. So for AI just to take over and write the code, I don't think anytime soon. And depending on the application that you're writing, is you need to understand all the suggestions in the code. I do see lots of cases where you don't want any AI involvement if you need to write a very robust application. But I think my guess, and I'm very curious to refer back to this discussion in about even 3 months' time, and to see what I've said and what I've thought and what has actually transpired. I'm sure they're going to be very different environments.
Indeed. Michael, I don't know if you've had exposure to it and seen any of the code generated by sort of these low-code platforms in relation to what you might have seen in that space versus what something like Copilot does. How do those things compare?
So I mean, a low-code environment. So first of all, someone had to write the code for the low-code environment to work. And I'm sure Copilot and ChatGPT had a big hand in that. In terms of using AI to put together low code, we've used quite a few products, one that builds up Azure cloud environments. So that can make suggestions when I add, for example, an app service in a database. It can then make suggestions, okay, you've added this, now you should consider this, take into these considerations. So it can really help guide you to put the application together, which parts of the puzzle need to connect. But I haven't worked with many of those platforms. And again, it'd be great if anyone else in the audience has worked with one. I'd be really interested to have a chat with you and see what your experience is with that.
Okay. Question from Musa. As a junior, how do I strike the balance between trusting my own critical thinking and problem solving versus leaning on Copilot? That's a great question, Musa.
Have that conversation with it. So write the code you want to write the way you want to write it. Turn Copilot on, see what suggestions it's making. And when you've written something, just ask Copilot, hey, what do you think of this? Is this the best practice? Can I do this, a different way? And just get that interaction going between the way you think it should be done and how Copilot suggests. But also don't just limit yourself to that. Go off, find one of the many trusted training sources or training resources out there. Learn the traditional way, and then take that knowledge, start coding again, and ask AI, hey, what do you think about this? So just look at it, again, it's Copilot. It's there to help you, to assist you. So just engage with it and see what comes.
Michael, does Copilot extend into the DevOps process around code management as well, given that it's in GitHub, but also given the fact that you were talking earlier about sort of the pull requests? So is that end-to-end integration happening between the AI tool sets and everything that the developers have to do?
So not yet. I mean, that would be the dream. It's to say Copilot, build me an application, set up a pipeline, deploy this to Azure in these staging environments and get the config right, please. So I imagine we will get there, but at the moment, or to my knowledge, there's no integration all the way into a pipeline. But you can certainly ask Copilot questions around how to do it. You can ask it for bicep code suggestions and things like that. But there's no complete integration at the moment.
Okay. So again, as you said, probably 3 months from now, there'll be a different answer to that altogether.
Or by lunchtime, you never know.
Depends on whether somebody typed that into ChatGPT or Copilot while we were talking about it, yeah?
Absolutely.
All right. I don't see any further questions from our audience at the moment. So Michael, maybe what I'll do is just ask you just your final opinion in terms of Copilot and other recommended tools that you would go, hey, these are the ones to really watch, really work with and become proficient in.
I think if I had one suggestion, I would say Copilot. Get the add-on, get an account, get Copilot chat up and running. And that tool alone, my experience, it's changed my existence as a developer because it takes away a lot of the mundane stuff. And again, it teaches me. Every now and again, sometimes I find that Copilot is not really giving me what I want. And I'll lean over to ChatGPT and ask it similar questions. And again, that's almost like the hierarchy. I would say Copilot, ChatGPT, but the latest edition. And then after that, I'll probably go to Google Bard. I'll go and look at Amazon Code Whisperer. That might become my favorite. You never know. But yeah, really just try things out, see what works for you. What works for me just might not fit into your workflow. And sort of be adventurous, try it out, and yeah, just but overall, just embrace AI.
Fantastic. I think on that note, Michael, again, thank you very much for your time today and for the effort you put into sharing what you've learned on the Copilot journey. I think that's been most valuable for the audience today. If the audience agrees, please do give Michael a bit of a clap there. That would be greatly appreciated. And on behalf of DVT, thank you all for having joined us today and really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Please do join us again on a Tuesday for another Tech Insights session presented by DVT. Thank you all and have a great day.